I found my son standing in the ash with a piece of paper in his hand, and the way he held it, fingers pinched at the corners like it might disintegrate, told me he had already read what was left of it. The fireplace at the lake house had not been cleaned in 3 years. We had come up to finally deal with the place, to strip the water-damaged drywall and pull the old carpet, and Michael had volunteered to clear the hearth while I worked on the plumbing in the kitchen. When I walked into the room, he did not look up. He just kept staring at the envelope. The edges were curled and brown. Fire had taken most of the left side, leaving only half an address visible. But the handwriting was unmistakable. I recognized the slant of the letters, the particular way the capital S curved back on itself. My wife had been gone for 2 years, a quiet death after a quieter illness, and I had thought I knew the shape of her life. The name on the envelope was Catherine Mercer. I had never heard it before. Michael handed it to me without a word. Inside was the remnant of a single page, most of it burned away. What remained were fragments of sentences in that same careful script. References to an account number, a mention of April, something about a meeting that never specified where or when. There was no date on what was left. I turned the envelope over and saw a postmark from 7 years ago, mailed from a town 2 states away that I had never visited and that my wife, to my knowledge, had never mentioned. I stood there with the ash on my fingers and a cold pressure building behind my ribs, and I understood that the ground I thought I stood on had always been thinner than I believed. My son's voice was careful. "Do you know who that is?" I looked at him. He was 24, lean and serious, a younger echo of his mother's focus. He had her eyes, dark and quick, and he used them the same way she had, cataloging details before committing to a response. I told him I did not know. He nodded once, and I saw him file that answer away alongside whatever he had already decided. The lake house had belonged to my wife's family, passed down from her father, who had built it in the 70s with his own hands and bad lumber. She had loved it in a distant, obligatory way, visiting once or twice a year and spending most of that time fixing what had broken since the last visit. After she died, I let it sit. I paid the taxes and ignored the rest. Michael had been the one to suggest we come up and make it livable again, or at least sellable, and I had agreed because I needed a project that could be measured in hammered nails and rolled paint. Now I was holding a letter to a woman who did not exist, written in my wife's hand, and the project had changed into something I could not measure at all. I set the envelope on the mantel and told Michael to finish the hearth. He looked at me with a question forming, then let it go. I went back to the kitchen and worked on the pipes under the sink, but my hands were not steady. I could hear him moving around in the other room, the scrape of the shovel against brick, the rattle of debris into a trash bag. When he finished, he came into the kitchen and leaned against the doorframe. "We should look into it," he said. I tightened a fitting and did not answer right away. The truth was, I had already decided to look into it. I just had not decided what I would do with what I found. I told him I would handle it. He studied me for a moment, then nodded and went outside to start loading the truck. I stayed under the sink longer than I needed to, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade, and wondered what my wife had needed to hide. That night, I sat alone in the house with the half-burned envelope on the table in front of me. Michael had gone back to the motel in town. I had told him I wanted to stay and get an early start in the morning. It was not entirely a lie. I did want an early start, but not on the renovations. I wanted to understand who Catherine Mercer was, and why my wife had written to her from a place she had no reason to be. I took a picture of the envelope and the letter with my phone, then placed both in a plastic sleeve and sealed it. I am not an investigator, but I have worked in finance long enough to know that money leaves trails, and that people who want to hide money leave trails they think no one will follow. The account number on the fragment was incomplete, only 5 digits visible, but it was enough to suggest structure, intention, and architecture of concealment. I opened my laptop and began with the simplest search, typing the name into a browser and waiting. There were no results. No social media profiles, no news articles, no public records that matched Catherine Mercer in any obvious way. I tried variations, added the name of the town from the postmark, filtered by age ranges and known associates. Nothing. I tried the account number fragment, knowing it would lead nowhere without context, and I was right. By midnight, I had only confirmed that if Catherine Mercer existed, she existed in a space designed not to be found. I made coffee and sat in the kitchen watching the lake through the window, black and still under a thin slice of moon. My wife had been methodical, a planner who scheduled her days in half-hour blocks and kept receipts sorted by category. She had run our household finances with the precision of an auditor, and I had trusted her to do it because she was better at it than I was, and because I had no reason not to trust her. Now I was wondering what else she had run with that same precision, what other structures she had built in spaces I never thought to examine. The next morning, Michael returned and found me in the same chair. He set down 2 cups of coffee from the diner and sat across from me without asking. I showed him the searches I had run. He looked at the screen, then at me, and asked the question I had been avoiding. What if it was just a pen name or something? An old friend from college? I considered it. It was possible. People use aliases for reasons that have nothing to do with deception. But my wife had been careful about sentiment. She did not keep old letters or maintain correspondence with people who had drifted out of her life. She was not sentimental. She was efficient, and efficient people do not mail letters to themselves under false names unless there is a structure behind it that requires a false name. I told Michael it was possible. Then I told him I was going to check the bank records. He nodded slowly, and I saw the shift happen in his face, the moment he understood that this was not a misunderstanding or a curiosity. This was an investigation, and his mother was the subject. We spent the rest of the day working on the house, pulling up the carpet in the hallway and scrubbing years of grime off the baseboards. The work was good. It kept my hands occupied and gave me an excuse not to talk. But the envelope stayed in the truck, sealed in its sleeve, and every time I walked past the vehicle, I felt its weight like a magnet pulling at my attention. By evening, I had made a decision. I would start with our joint accounts and move backward, looking for any transactions that did not fit the pattern of our life together. If Catherine Mercer was tied to money, then money would be the thread that led me to her. That night I drove back alone. Michael stayed at the lake house, saying he wanted to finish the hallway. I think he wanted to give me space to do what I needed to do without him watching. I appreciated it. The drive was 2 hours through empty roads and small towns that closed at sundown. I used the time to think through what I knew and what I needed to find out. My wife had been the primary account holder on most of our finances. I had access, but I had rarely looked. Now I would look at everything. At home, I pulled up 7 years of bank statements and started reading. The process was slow and tedious. I made a spreadsheet and logged every transaction over $500, cross-referencing dates and amounts against my own memory of what we had done and when. Most of it was ordinary. Mortgage payments, insurance, car repairs, medical bills. But there were gaps. Small ones at first, then larger. Transfers to an account I did not recognize, always in round numbers, always on the 15th of the month. The transfers had started 9 years ago and stopped 2 years ago, right around the time she was diagnosed. The total was just over $200,000. I sat back and stared at the screen. $200,000, moved in careful increments, always below the threshold that would trigger automatic scrutiny. The account number for the transfers was not complete in the statements, but it had a prefix I recognized from offshore banks, the kind that cater to clients who want privacy more than interest rates. I wrote down the partial number and compared it to the fragment from the letter. The visible digits matched. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my office with the lights off and watched the numbers on the screen until they blurred together. My wife had built something, a structure, a second life, and she had done it with our money, siphoned off in amounts small enough that I would never notice, but large enough that over time they amounted to a fortune. I did not feel anger yet. I felt something colder and more surgical, a need to know the full shape of what she had built and why she had needed to build it at all. The next day, I called our accountant. His name was Roger, a man in his 60s who had handled our taxes for 15 years and who had always spoken of my wife with a respect that bordered on reverence. I told him I was reviewing some old records and needed copies of our joint filings going back a decade. He said he could have them ready by the end of the week. I thanked him and hung up, then sat with the phone in my hand and wondered if Roger had known, if he had helped her, if the structure she built had required more than one set of hands. I drove back to the lake house that afternoon. Michael was on the porch with a sander working on the railings. He looked up when I pulled in, and I saw the question in his face. I told him what I had found. He set down the sander and listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked the same question I had been asking myself. Why would she do that? I did not have an answer. People hide money for many reasons: fear, greed, contingency, control. My wife had not been poor. She had not come from poverty or trauma that would have taught her to hoard resources in secret. She had been practical, yes, but not paranoid. And the money had not been used. It had just sat there, accumulating in an account tied to a name that did not exist, waiting for a purpose that never came. Or perhaps it had come, and I simply had not seen it. Michael stood and walked to the edge of the porch. He looked out at the lake, hands in his pockets, and I could see him working through the same calculations I had been working through for hours. Finally, he turned back. "Do you think she was planning to leave?" The question landed like a stone. I had not let myself think it, but now that it was spoken, I could not unhear it. Yes. The answer was yes. Or maybe she was just building an exit that she never intended to use, a kind of insurance policy against a disaster she never expected to face. But the account had stayed active. The money had kept moving until she got sick. That suggested intention. That suggested a plan. I told Michael I did not know, but I intended to find out.